Welcome back to From Adam to Jesus. Last time we followed Isaac and Rebekah as God continued his covenant through the next generation. Today we're going to follow the story of Jacob and Esau. And at first glance, it seems like a story about two brothers, twins who struggled with each other from the womb and whose rivalry would shape the future of two nations. But at its heart, this isn't really a story about two brothers. It's the story of a man who spent much of his life trying to obtain God's blessings through his own schemes, only to discover that God's promises could never be earned. It's the story of how Jacob became Israel. Genesis 25 opens with another familiar problem. Rebekah is barren. And we've seen this before with Sarah. Isaac and Rebekah have now been married for 20 years without children. 20 years. And what did Isaac do? He prayed. Genesis 25 tells us that Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife. Think about that. For 20 years, Isaac and Rebekah waited. For 20 years, there were no children. For 20 years, the promised covenant line appeared to be at a standstill. And during that time, Isaac prayed. The chapter doesn't tell us how often he prayed. It simply tells us that he brought his burden before the Lord and that the Lord answered. What a contrast to Abraham and Sarah's attempt to solve the problem through Hagar. Isaac doesn't devise a plan. He prays, and God responds. That's a reminder for us as well. God's delays are not necessarily God's denials. Sometimes his timing is different than ours, but he remains faithful to his promises. Eventually, Rebekah becomes pregnant, but something unusual is happening inside her womb. The struggle is so intense that she seeks the Lord. Now, don't miss what's happening here. Isaac prayed when they couldn't have children, and now Rebekah seeks the Lord when she doesn't understand her pregnancy. That's a healthy pattern. When Isaac has a problem, he takes it to God. When Rebekah has a question, she takes it to God. And God responds and reveals some remarkable things. First of all, he says, 2 nations are in your womb. Well, what does that mean? It means you're having twins. And not only that, God tells her they're going to be boys. And this is the ultimate gender reveal without an ultrasound. And then God finally says, and the older will serve the younger. Okay, that would have been shocking. In the ancient world, the firstborn son normally received both the birthright and the blessing. But before either child is born, God announces that he's going to reverse expectations. And when the boys arrive, Esau comes out first, and then Jacob emerges holding on to Esau's heel. It's almost as if the struggle has already begun, and in many ways, it never really stops. Now, names mattered in the ancient world. Jacob's name carries the idea of heel grabber, one who follows behind, one who even supplants another. And throughout much of his life, Jacob lives up to that name. But by the end of the story, God gives him a new name, Israel. And the entire story is really a journey from one name to another. Now, here's an interesting detail. Abraham is still alive when the twins are born. We usually miss that because it looks like he died earlier in the chapter. But this chapter was not written in chronological order. In fact, Abraham lives until the boys are 15 years old. Want to hear something even more astonishing than that? Shem, the son of Noah, is apparently still alive as well. What? See, this is why those genealogy numbers are important. You see things that you don't normally see. Now, as the boys grow older, the differences become obvious. Esau becomes a hunter, while Jacob prefers life around the tents. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly what Jacob was doing there, but Jewish tradition says that he spent time learning from Shem and Eber, descendants of Noah who are still living during this period. And we can't verify that tradition, but if it's true, think about what that means. Jacob could have learned stories about the flood and generations before it from people who actually lived through those events. Abraham himself may have learned from Shem, and now imagine his grandsons sitting at the feet of the same man. The world wasn't nearly as far removed from Noah as we often imagine. We tend to think of these stories as ancient history separated by countless generations. But in reality, the connections between them were much closer than our modern minds often realize. Okay, one day Esau comes home exhausted and hungry from a hunt. Okay, can I share another interesting tradition from ancient Jewish writings? Some Jewish traditions say that on this particular day, Esau had been out hunting and actually killed Nimrod. Yeah, that Nimrod, the mighty ruler associated with Babel. Okay, now the Bible never tells us that that happened, so we can't verify it. But if the tradition is true, it might help us explain why Esau later says, "I'm about to die anyway." Whether that's what happened or not, one thing is clear. Esau is thinking about only the present moment. Jacob has been home cooking some stew. Esau wants food. He is famished. Jacob wants something else. The birthright. Now, the birthright wasn't merely extra money. It included a double portion of the inheritance and leadership of the family after the father's death. Think about the royal family in England. It's like you're next in line to the throne. For the covenant family, it carried spiritual significance as well. And Esau trades it all for a single meal, bread and stew. Later, Hebrews describes Esau as a godless man who sold his birthright for one meal. The problem wasn't hunger. The problem was that Esau valued temporary satisfaction more than God's promises. And if we're honest, that's still a temptation today. How often do we exchange eternal priorities for temporary pleasures? Years pass. Esau marries 2 Hittite women. The marriages bring grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Remember how Abraham sent his servant far away from the Canaanite people to find a wife for Isaac? Well, that didn't happen in this situation. Esau went rogue, and it caused a great deal of heartache for Isaac and Rebekah. But Esau's choices weren't this family's only problem. Before we get to the deception, we need to step back and look at the family dynamics that have been quietly unfolding for years. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed the game that Esau brought him. Rebekah loved Jacob. Okay, that's a dangerous combination. Parents aren't supposed to pick favorites. And yet that's exactly what happens here. And once favoritism enters a family, division usually isn't far behind. And then we arrive at one of the most famous scenes in Genesis. Isaac is old. His eyesight is failing. He believes the time has come to pass the family blessing to Esau. Isaac seems determined to bless Esau despite what God told Rebekah before the twins were born. And Rebekah seems determined to secure the blessing for Jacob. Everybody knows God's promise, yet nobody seems willing to simply trust God to fulfill it. Earlier, Esau had sold his birthright. Now Isaac is preparing to give the family blessing. Now they're related, but they're not the same thing. The birthright determined who inherited the family's leadership and possessions. The blessing affirmed God's covenant promises for the next generation. Now, Rebekah remembers what God said before the twins were born. But instead of trusting God to fulfill his promise, she devises a plan. Sounds to me like a Hagar and Sarah situation. Rebekah thinks God needs some help with the plan. And her plan is that Jacob will disguise himself as Esau. But before we're too hard on Jacob, let's notice something. When Rebekah presents the plan, Jacob isn't exactly eager to go along with it. He points out the obvious problem. Dad is going to know I'm not Esau. But notice his concern isn't that the plan is dishonest. His concern is that the plan might fail. He's worried about receiving a curse instead of a blessing. In other words, Jacob isn't wrestling with whether the deception is right or wrong. He's wrestling with whether he'll get caught. And Rebekah assures him that she'll take responsibility if things go wrong. So the plan moves forward. And the deception works because Isaac's sight is not what it used to be. And then comes the most important question in the entire story. Isaac asks, "Who are you, my son?" And Jacob answers, "I am Esau, your firstborn." Now I want you to tuck that answer away because we're going to hear another question much later in Jacob's life. And his answer will be very different. Now Isaac isn't completely convinced. Jacob sounds like Jacob, but he feels like Esau, and he smells like Esau. So Isaac proceeds to bless him anyway. And then Esau comes back just after Jacob leaves, and he is furious when he finds out what happened. and he vows to kill Jacob. So Jacob listens to his mother again and flees to her relatives in Haran. Jacob leaves home with almost nothing. No servants, no wealth, no impressive caravan, just a fugitive running from the consequences of his choices. Very different from the trip Abraham's servant made decades ago. And one night, Jacob stops to sleep, and using a stone as a pillow, yep, a stone. I guess there were no MyPillow stores around. He falls asleep and dreams of a stairway reaching from earth to heaven. Angels are ascending and descending on it, and God stands above it. And there, God repeats the covenant promises first given to Abraham and then to Isaac. Jacob names the place Bethel, which literally means the house of God. Now remember where Jacob is right now. He's running. He's alone. He's deceived his father. His brother wants him dead. And yet this is the moment that God appears to him. Isn't that amazing? God doesn't wait until Jacob gets his life together. God meets Jacob in the middle of his mess. And many years later, Jesus alludes to this very scene when speaking to Nathanael in John chapter 1. Jesus presents himself as the true connection between heaven and earth. Jacob's ladder pointed forward to Jesus. Jacob finally arrives in Haran and meets Rachel, and he falls in love immediately. It is love at first sight. He is so captivated by her that he agrees to work 7 years to marry her. This is all he has to offer as a bride price. He didn't come with 10 camels and all sorts of jewelry. But 7 years. See, that's not like dating today. There's no hand-holding or kissing or anything. How many guys and gals could handle that today? 7 years later, the wedding arrives. And you know Jacob is so excited. He's worked hard for this. He's waited so long. And the ceremony happens at night. Jacob takes his bride into the bridal chamber. It's dark. He can't see her face. But who cares? This isn't a moment where he's studying her face. He's simply assuming the woman beside him is Rachel. And the next morning, Jacob wakes up to the light of day and discovers he's married to Leah, Rachel's older sister, instead. The deceiver has been deceived. Jacob finally meets someone who can play the same game he does. Uncle Laban. The same trick that Jacob played on Isaac, Uncle Laban played on him. You can imagine the irony sinking in for Jacob. But he really wants Rachel, so he agrees to work 7 more years. What happens is that they finish the wedding week with Leah, and then Jacob marries Rachel after the 7 days are over, agreeing to work 7 more years after that. Now, I want to know how awkward Leah's wedding week was. In their culture, the wedding feast lasted 7 days. Was Rachel hiding in another room the entire week? Was she there attending to her sister? What was Leah thinking? This was some soap opera drama. And that's just the season 1 finale. Season 2 has a family competition that quickly gets out of hand. Because over the next decade, Jacob has 12 sons with 4 women. The baby wars were on. And the 12 sons who are born will become the 12 tribes of Israel. Of those 12, Jesus would come through the 4th son, Judah, and his name means praise. Now, we won't spend any more time on Judah today, but we will bring him back into focus in the next episode. Now, if you need to see a family tree chart on all of this, check out my website. I'll have a link in the show notes. After 20 years, Jacob finally returns home. But one problem remains. Esau, the brother he wronged, the brother who once wanted him dead. And the night before their meeting, Jacob finds himself alone. A mysterious man wrestles with him until daybreak. Hosea later identifies this figure as both an angel and God in some sense. And Jacob refuses to let go. He wants a blessing. Have you ever wondered why God wrestles with Jacob all night? Certainly God could have ended the match instantly. In fact, he eventually disables Jacob with just a touch. So the wrestling isn't about God's strength. It's about Jacob's perseverance. Jacob has spent his whole life grasping for blessings. And now he finally realizes that the blessing can only come from God. And then comes the second great question. God asks, "What is your name?" Remember, years earlier, Isaac asked, "Who are you?" And Jacob answered, "I am Esau." Now God asks, "What is your name?" And this time, Jacob answers truthfully, Jacob. In other words, I am the deceiver. I am the heel grabber. I am the schemer. I am Jacob. And only then does God change his name, Israel. The goal was never simply to get Jacob into the promised land. The goal was to transform Jacob into Israel. The next day, Jacob finally meets Esau, and instead of revenge, he finds grace. The brothers are reconciled after 20 years apart. Isn't that just like God? The relationship Jacob spent 20 years fearing turned out to be the relationship God had been already working on all along. It's one of the most beautiful moments in Genesis. The man who spent his life grasping, scheming, and running finally begins walking in humility. Not perfectly, but differently, changed. Later in the narrative, Jacob returns to Bethel, the place where God first appeared to him as a fugitive. And there God reaffirms both the covenant and Jacob's new identity as Israel. Now, where do we see Jesus in this story? We see him in the stairway at Bethel, the bridge between heaven and earth. We see him in Judah, through whom the Messiah would come. And we see him in Jacob's transformation. Because the gospel is not the story of perfect people earning God's blessings. It's the story of God changing imperfect people by his grace. Jacob's story reminds us that God's people have never been perfect people. Abraham struggled with fear. Isaac struggled with trusting what he could see rather than what God had said. Jacob struggled with deception. And yet God's covenant continued, not because of human faithfulness, but because of God's faithfulness. The man who once stood before his father and said, "I am Esau," eventually stood before God and honestly said, "I am Jacob." And that honesty became the turning point of his life. Next time, we'll follow one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, a young man who goes from favored son to slave, from prisoner to ruler, and becomes God's instrument for preserving the covenant family during a time of famine. And once again, we'll discover that even what people intend for evil, God can use for good. Thank you for joining me on From Adam to Jesus. If this study encouraged you, visit teresahagler.com for study guides, resources, and upcoming episodes. Until next time, keep reading, keep studying, and keep looking for Jesus throughout the pages of Scripture.